Hi, one of the challenges of the new SAT, the digital SAT that's launching in March 2023, is that there's very little material available for the reading section, which has completely changed from the paper and pencil version of the SAT. Reading passages now will be small, 50 to 60 word passages, and every question will have its own passage. To prepare for this, what I have done in this video is picked up small passages that used to come in the pre-2016 version of the SAT and use those passages for practice so that you can get a flavor of the kind of passages and questions you will see on the digital SAT. So what you see on the screen is one such small passage pair. Questions 6 to 9 are based on the following passages. So let's read passage 1. I know what your email inbox looks like, and it isn't pretty. A babble of come-ons and lies from hucksters and con artists. To find your real email, you must wade through the torrent of fraud and obscenity known politely as unsolicited bulk email and colloquially as spam. In a perverse tribute to the power of the online revolution, we are all suddenly getting the same mail, easy weight loss, get-rich-quick schemes, etc. The crush of these messages is now numbered in billions per day. It's becoming a major systems and engineering and network problem, says one email expert. Spammers are gaining control of the internet. So the first passage, which is basically a paragraph, talks about the problem of spam, right? So question 6 is the primary purpose of passage 1. And the old SAT had 5 options per question. So it is to make a comparison, dispute a hypothesis, settle a controversy, justify a distinction, or highlight a concern. So if I look at the way the passage is written, it basically speaks about the problem of spam and how the problem has been increasing. So that would be a concern, and it's highlighting a concern. So that's an option that I like. Now, option A cannot be correct because there is no comparison in the passage. It's not like the passage is comparing the email age with the pre-email age. So option A can't be right. Option B, dispute a hypothesis. There is no hypothesis that is being disputed. It's not that the passage says that this is what was said or this is what was believed, but now that it is not true, right? So it is not disputing a hypothesis. So B is out. Settle a controversy. There is no controversy being settled. So C is out. And there is no distinction being made in the passage. So D also doesn't make sense. So for question 6, my answer is E. I'm writing the answers here because we'll go and check the answers at the end of the video. Okay, let's read the second passage for question 7. Many people who hate spam assume that it is protected as free speech, not necessarily so. The United States Supreme Court has previously ruled that individuals may preserve a threshold of privacy. Nothing in the Constitution compels us to listen to or view any unwanted communication, whatever its merit, wrote Chief Justice Warren Burger in a 1970 decision. We therefore categorically reject the argument that a vendor has a right to send unwanted material into the home of another. With regard to a seemingly similar problem, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act of 1991 made it illegal in the United States to send unsolicited faxes. Why not extend the act to include unsolicited bulk email? So the second passage offers more of the prospect of a solution of the problem raised in the first one, right? It talks about how there was a Supreme Court decision about unwanted communication and how individual citizens, private citizens, have a right to deny such communication, right? So, so that was one. And then this also was extended to the Telephone Consumer Protection Act that made it illegal to send unsolicited faxes. So why not do this for email as well? So the primary purpose of passage 2 is to confirm a widely held belief, discuss the inadequacies of a ruling, defend a controversial technology, analyze a widespread social problem, lay the foundation for a course of action. So again, I like option E here, right? Because the foundation for a course of action, the course of action being putting a stop to any kind of unsolicited email, any kind of spam. So the foundation for that is being laid through these arguments that are presented. What the justice said in the 1970 decision, what the Telephone Protection Act said. So I like E. Confirm a widely held belief. There is no widely held belief that is being confirmed, right? That doesn't make sense. So option A is out. Discuss the inadequacies of a ruling. The ruling that is given in the passage, the 1970 decision, is actually presented as one way that we can get a solution to the problem. So there are no inadequacies of it that are discussed. Defend a controversial technology. There is no defense of any technology here. So option C is out. And analyze a widespread social problem. I wouldn't call this a widespread social problem, right? It is something which is an irritant. It is something that bothers people, but this is somewhat of an extreme, right? So D is not a good answer. So for seventh also, I would like to keep option E. Okay, question 8. What would be the most likely reaction by the author of passage 1 to the argument cited in line 16 to 21 of passage 2? So in 16 to 21, the second author is saying nothing in the Constitution compels us to listen to or view any unwanted communication, whatever its merit. We therefore categorically reject the argument that a vendor has a right to send unwanted material. So how would the first guy react to this, right? Surprise at the assumption that freedom of speech is indispensable to democracy. Dismay at the Supreme Court's vigorous defense of vendors' rights. Hope that the same reasoning would be applied to all unsolicited email. Concern for the plight of mass marketers facing substantial economic losses. And appreciation for the political complexity of the debate about spam. So I know that both authors have a problem with spam, right? So the passages are related to the extent that the first one presents it as a problem and the second one looks at possible solutions. So they both consider spam to be a problem. So I like option C here. The first person would hope that the same logic about unsolicited messages, unsolicited material should be applicable to spam, right? The first person would want that. Surprise at the assumption that freedom of speech is indispensable. That is, first of all, this is something that goes beyond the scope of the first passage, right? The second passage does talk about the fact that people assume that anything that is unwanted and is sent to us cannot technically be rejected because there is a freedom of speech clause in the Constitution. So anything that anybody wants to say or send across, it's protected. And the second guy says that's not true. Legally, that's not true. But the first person does not have any comment to make on freedom of speech. So A is beyond the scope of the first passage. Dismay at the Supreme Court's vigorous defense of vendors' rights. This option is wrong at many levels. First of all, the Supreme Court did not defend vendors' rights. The Supreme Court actually said that vendors cannot send unsolicited material to potential customers. So that's not true. And even if it were true, yes, the first person would probably be dismayed, but it's not true. So B is out. D, concern for the plight of mass marketers facing substantial economic losses. The first guy doesn't care about mass marketers. He wants to stop receiving unsolicited email from them. So D is out. Appreciation for the political complexity about the debate. Again, that's not something that's true. The both of them, and the first one particularly, takes a very workday approach towards the problem of spam, right? It's not really about the politics of spam, etc. So E is also out. And so for 8, I would put C. Unlike the author of passage 1, the author of passage 2 criticizes a practice, offers an example, proposes a solution, states an opinion, quotes an expert. So let's see. We know that both of them talk about experts, right? There is an expert in the first one also. So E is definitely not true. We also know that the second guy does propose a solution. That is one of the first things that you notice. While the first guy presents the problem, right? So I like C. Criticizes a practice. I think they are both critical. And the first guy is explicitly critical of spam, and the second guy is implicitly critical, which is to say that he presents examples, cases of how to reduce spam, how to ban spam. So I don't think that's a point of difference. Offers an example. I don't think the second guy necessarily offers an example, right? He offers quotations, he offers arguments, but not an example. So I would not like B. And states an opinion. I think both of them state opinions, right? That's not a point of difference. So again, for ninth also, I like option C. There are these two tiny passages that you can see on the screen, each with two questions. So let's begin. Let's answer these questions and then we'll grade our answers. Passage 1, newspaper editor and political commentator Henry Louis Mencken was a force of nature, brushing aside all objects, animal and mineral, in his headlong rush to the publicity that surely awaited him. He seized each day, shook it to within an inch of its life, and then gaily went on to the next. No matter where his writing appeared, it was quoted widely, his pungently outspoken opinions debated hotly. Nobody else could make so many people so angry or make so many others laugh so hard. Okay, so this seems to have been taken from the obituary of Mencken, who was a newspaper editor and commentator. And it describes him as this really sharp critic, as this really sharp writer who did not spare anyone when it came to presenting his opinions. His views were widely read. His views were widely read, and they made a lot of people angry, but they also made a lot of people laugh in the sense that, they could see some truth in what he wrote, right? So that is what the passage tells us. So look at question 9. In lines 4 to 5, the word seized and shook help establish which aspect of Mencken's personality. He seized each day, shook it to within an inch of its life, and then gaily went on to the next. So this indicates a sense of being forceful, right? He was forceful, he was active, he made sure that he was always on his toes getting new story ideas. So his code of honor, his sense of humor, his vindictiveness, his intensity, his petulance. Okay, so I like D, right? D, the fact that he was intense, the fact that he was always, going after something, going after a story or looking at what he could write about. So I like D. Okay, option A, code of honor doesn't really come across in those lines, right? Those lines talk about how he was devoted to his work. He would go to any lengths, right? But that's not something that honor speaks about, right? So honor is kind of beyond the scope. His sense of humor doesn't come across in those lines. Those lines are about his intensity, his work ethic. So, okay, vindictiveness. Vindictiveness comes from the word vindictive, which means somebody who is prone to take revenge, somebody who is prone to go after another person whom he thinks has wronged him. So again, that is not what it is saying, right? He is a forceful writer. He is a writer who goes to great lengths to get a good topic, but he's not vindictive, right? So option C is beyond the scope. And petulance is irritability, right? Somebody who is irritable, somebody who gets frustrated and snaps at people. So that again doesn't come across. We don't really know that about him, whether he was irritable. We all we know is that he was intense. So first question 9, I'll write D. Okay. Question 10, the public response described in line 6 to 8 most strongly suggests that Mencken's writings were. So you can see that no matter where his writing appeared, it was quoted widely. His pungently outspoken opinions debated hotly. So one is that he was a popular writer, right? A lot of people quoted him, a lot of people read him, but also he was somewhat, he inspired debate, right? His views were not those that were readily accepted by everyone. right? So he inspired debate. So let's look at what is the best word to convey his writings. Authoritative, controversial, arrogant, informal, frivolous. Okay, so I like controversial, right? Because controversial is something that excites debate, right? Something that leads to people looking at various facets of something, right? So controversial is something I like. Authoritative is not true as per the passage. We don't know if his writings were authoritative. His writings were opinionated. He brought his personal stamp to each of his writing, but whether he was an authority on those subjects, the passage doesn't mention that. So A is beyond the scope of the passage. Arrogant doesn't fit the context. We are talking about his writing. So arrogant is not the right word for it. Informal, we don't know if his writings were informal. We know that they were debated, but this is something the passage does not prove or provide evidence for. And frivolous. In fact, the passage suggests that his writings were the opposite of frivolous, right? To be frivolous is to have little value, right? But his writings were greatly debated. They were intense pieces, opinionated pieces. So I like option B, controversial, for question 10. Okay, let's do the next passage. The ability to see the situation as your opponents see it, as difficult as it may be, is one of the most important skills that you can possess as a negotiator. You must know more than simply that they see things differently. It is not enough to study them like beetles under a microscope. You need to know what it feels like to be a beetle. To accomplish this, you should be prepared to withhold judgment as you try on their views. Your opponents may well believe that their views are right as strongly as you believe yours are. Okay, so this seems to be taken from some negotiation manual, which is kind of presenting one, it addresses the reader as you, right? So it sounds as though it's giving advice, right? It's telling you what to do. So it says that if you are trying to negotiate and if you want to be a skilled negotiator, it is not enough simply to think or consider the positions of the opposing party, right? You should also learn to think like them, right? That is where the concept of the beetle comes. It is not enough to study them like beetles. You should know what it feels like to be a beetle, which is to say that you must consider their views, and you might think that their views are not correct and you have a better deal to make or you have a better proposition to offer, but you must consider their views as correct, because only then would you be able to be a good negotiator. If you can get into their mind and understand where they are coming from, your negotiation would be good, right? So that's kind of the premise of this. So so let's look at question 11, the reference to beetles in line 5 to 6. So option A, people need to be more attuned to their surroundings. Effective negotiation is more of a science than an art. People can be made to do what they would prefer not to do. Effective negotiation requires identifying with a different viewpoint. People feel uncomfortable when their actions are under scrutiny. So I like D, right? So my first instinct is to choose D, but let's unpack the other options. Option A says people need to be more attuned to their surroundings. That's kind of vague because we're not talking about being attuned to your surroundings. We're talking about being attuned to the party you're negotiating with. You need to be attuned to what they are feeling, what their thought process might be. So A is not a good answer. Okay, B, effective negotiation is more of a science than an art. I don't think that's what the beetle example brings up. If anything, it kind of brings up that it's more of an art than a science, because you kind of have to get into the mind of the person, right? So you have to kind of look at the subjective nature of the negotiation, etc. So B doesn't really capture what the passage is trying to say. Option C, people can be made to do what they would prefer not to do. That's not what the beetle example is saying, right? The beetle example is saying that you need to be able to feel like a beetle. You need to be able to get into the mind of the negotiator. What you do with that information comes later. So C is not relevant to the beetle example. And option E, people feel uncomfortable when their actions are under scrutiny. Again, this is not about people's feelings. It's about what you need to do if you want to be a good negotiator. So option D, which is saying that you need to identify with a different viewpoint as brought about in the passage through the beetle example, what it feels like to be a beetle. So that seems to be a good option. So for 11, I'll go with D. And number 12, the primary purpose of the passage is to persuade people to defend their positions on critical issues, indicate a specific ability that is useful in negotiation, encourage people to be more accepting of others, argue that a few people are fit for the demands of negotiation, and suggest that negotiators should always seek consensus. So I like B, right? He's talking about the specific ability, the ability to get inside the mind of the opposite party, to think like they do, as being useful to negotiation. So B is something I like. Option A, persuade people to defend their positions on critical issues. That's not what the passage is saying at all, right? The passage is rather saying that if you want to be a successful negotiator, you should be able to think like the opposite party. So A is not correct. Option C, encourage people to be more accepting of others. To be able to think like they do and to use this as an advantage is not to accept them, right? So C kind of distorts what the passage is saying. Argue that few people are fit for the demands of negotiation. There is no mention of the kind of people that are fit for this task. It's only about this specific trait that is useful. So D is out. Suggest that negotiators should always seek consensus. There is this always seek consensus. To do something always or never, that's like an extreme, which you should be careful of. The second thing is it's not really talking about consensus. It's not saying that you need to arrive at a common ground in negotiation. It's talking about a skill set that is useful. So E doesn't make sense. So for 12th also, yeah, I choose B. So here we have a paired passage 1 and passage 2, and we have 4 questions from this. This, I think, is from the 2013 SAT. So let's begin. Just quickly scanning the questions. Question 9 is about capturing the relationship between the two passages. Question 10 is about passage 2. Question 11 is the difference between the passages, and question 12 as well. So 3 out of 4 questions are, in fact, even number 10 is about the relationship. So in fact, all the 4 questions are about the relationship between the passages. So let's read. Passage 1. Food has always been considered one of the most salient markers of cultural traditions. When I was a small child, food was the only thing that helped identify my family as Filipino-American. We ate pancit lag-lag, a noodle dish, and my father put patis, salty fish sauce, on everything. However, even this connection lessened as I grew older. As my parents became more acculturated, we ate less typically Filipino food. When I was 12, my mother took cooking classes and learned to make French and Italian dishes. When I was in high school, we ate chicken, marsala, and shrimp fra diablo more often than Filipino dishes like pancit lag-lag. Okay, so the first passage is kind of describing the changing cultural traditions within a family, an immigrant family, Filipino-American, as they become more acculturated, as they fit more and more into American society, as they become more and more acclimatized to the culture around them. So when the speaker was a small child, the food on the table was largely Filipino. He describes pancit lag-lag and the father putting patis on everything. But as he grew older and the family came to become more and more American, the food also became more American, right? The mother took cooking classes in typically American dishes, European dishes. And when he went to high school, by the time he went to high school, the food on the table was more American. So this is presenting how cultural traditions and changing traditions reflect changes in food habits through a very personal lens, right? That's the first one. Passage 2, Jean Anton Brillat Savarin, who in 1825 confidently announced, "Tell me what you eat and I'll tell you who you are," would have no trouble describing cultural identities of the United States. Our food reveals us as tolerant adventurers who do not feel constrained by tradition. We play with our food far more readily than we preserve the culinary rules of our varied ancestors. Americans have no single national cuisine. What unites American eaters culturally is how we eat, not what we eat. As eaters, Americans mingle the culinary traditions of many regions and cultures. We are multi-ethnic eaters. So this second passage starts with a quotation about maybe a food writer or a food critic or an anthropologist who said that, "Tell me what you eat and I'll tell you who you are," which is to say that food is a central part of our identity, right? What we eat and how we eat tells us where we come from, right? And the fact that the author presents that quotation to segue into a description of the multi-ethnic nature of American food. American food is not one kind of food, right? American food is made up of food from all the nationalities that make America, right? So, and obviously he says that, we are multi-ethnic eaters. So this is more of an opinion presented through a somewhat impersonal look at food compared to the first passage, which was a very personal take. The other thing that you notice is that the second author, while he says that we are multi-ethnic eaters and that we kind of mingle and we kind of mix and match, and that's how we choose our food, the first passage kind of goes against that idea, because the first passage does suggest that there is a very particular kind of food that is identified as American. And the food of the speaker's culture, Filipino food, was not part of that tradition, because that is why that shift happened from away from Filipino food and towards so-called American food. So I think there is a tension between the two passages with regard to what American food is. Is it a particular kind of food, as the first passage suggests, or is it multi-ethnic and welcomes all, as the second passage suggests? So it's always important to have this discussion with yourself about the relationship between the passages before you come to the questions, because only when you understand what the passages are clearly saying would you be able to eliminate options and come to the right answer. So number 9, which of the following statements best captures the relationship between the two passages? Option A, passage 1 notes problems for which passage 2 proposes a solution. Option B, passage 1 presents claims that are debunked by passage 2. Option C, passage 2 furnishes a larger context for the experiences described in passage 1. D, passage 2 provides an update of the situation depicted in passage 1. And E, passage 2 uses material present in passage 1 to correct a popular misconception. Okay, this is a good question. I don't think the right answer is very obvious on the first reading, but we can work with elimination before we come to the right answer. So passage 1 notes problems for which passage 2 proposes solutions. I don't think I would call what the first passage is describing a problem. I don't think he is saying that I wish we did not start eating American food. I wish we had stuck to Filipino food. I think he's describing a process that happened naturally. So I don't like option A. Option B, passage 1 presents claims that are debunked by passage 2. I think debunked is a very strong word, right? And extreme words are generally they generally don't make good answers, because I don't think he's debunking that claim. I think he's presenting a larger context for the claim of what food can be described as American. So there is a tension, sure, between the passages, but I would not say that the second passage cancels out the first passage. So I don't like B. Option C, passage 2 furnishes a larger context for the experiences described in passage 1. Yes, I think this is a good option because he does talk about the multi-ethnic nature of American food. And passage 1 kind of does say that we did have both kinds of food, but it takes that a step further by saying that even within that multi-ethnic tradition, we were moving from Filipino food to what is typically considered American food. So I like C, and we'll decide if that should be my answer. Passage 2 provides an update of the situation. No, this update of the situation is a little off, right? It's not that first of all, update sounds better for something like a software, right? Or something like a gadget. This is a social situation, an anthropological situation. So I don't like option D. Option E, passage 2 uses material presented passage 1 to correct a popular misconception. First of all, the way the second passage is written, it doesn't sound like it is trying to correct anything, right? It is not kind of saying that what is thought or what is believed is wrong, and this is what is the right thing to believe. So this correcting a popular misconception does not really fit with what the second passage does. So, right. So I like C. I think C is a good neutral answer that captures the relationship. So let's write C for option, C for question 9. Okay. Okay, so I'll write it in the sidelines because we'll have to grade it later. Okay. Let's go to question 10. The author of passage 2 would most likely regard the mother's willingness to make French and Italian dishes as. So before we come to the options, what would the second passage's author's response would be? What would his response be? It would be a positive response, right? He would say that this accords with what America is all about, that people come here from all over the world and then they kind of mix and mingle and share their cuisines and come up with these multi-ethnic identities that includes multi-ethnic food. So he would describe this behavior as, so I'm just scanning the options and I already like option C. So I'm just going to put a quick dot over here. Okay, laughably pretentious. That's definitely not correct. That's like an extremely negative option. He would not call that pretentious at all. Pretentious is something that you like you aim to do something or you want to do something that you can't reach, right? So that's like a really negative option. That's not true at all. Understandably conservative. So first of all, the second guy is not suggesting that being conservative is what American cuisine is about. So this understandably conservative doesn't make sense. And also the mother's action to try new cuisines is not conservative. So this is wrong at so many levels. A C, as I said, is a good option. He would say that this is what Americans do. They try different things and they assimilate those experiences. A regrettable compromise? No, I don't think the second passage would call this regrettable. I think the second passage celebrates this. So D, definitely not. A surprising attitude. Again, this is not surprising to the second author. This is something that he thinks is very common. So yes, so something which is typically American. So for 10th also, I choose option C. Okay, I'll just use an eraser now because I only need to remove these. Okay, question 11. The two passages differ in their discussions of food, primarily in that passage 1 considers specific dishes eaten by particular people, whereas passage 2 comments on a culture's general attitude towards eating. So yeah, that seems to be a good option because the first passage is kind of focused more on what Filipinos eat and how his family, this person's family, kind of moved away from that food. So I'll keep A for now, though I would like an option which talks about this cultural trend of shifting away from one cuisine to another, right? Um, Passage 1 contrasts the cuisines of different cultures, whereas Passage 2 emphasizes culinary practices common to all cultures. So this is definitely not correct. The first passage is not contrasting the cuisines of different cultures. It is only speaking about Filipino food, right? So B is out. Passage 1 presents an abstract theory of food, whereas Passage 2 offers a historical analysis of consumption. So there's no abstract theory of food, right? It's a very concrete sense of what the family ate on the table and how it moved from one cuisine to a mix of cuisines, right? So yeah, C, I don't like. Passage 1 emphasizes the role of nostalgia in food preferences, whereas Passage 2 rejects that approach as overly sentimental. I don't think nostalgia is the central idea of Passage 1. It's more about describing a change, right? He doesn't say that I wish we did not change or I remember those days with fondness, right? So there's no nostalgia there. Option E, Passage 1 outlines some popular choices in cuisine, whereas Passage 2 underscores those that are more unusual. So second passage does not look at unusual choices in cuisine. And the first one doesn't talk about popular choices in cuisine. It's about very specific context in which what this family ate and how that represents a typical Filipino food, right? So yes, A is the best answer. We decide A is best because it does bring out that specificity with a more general attitude. Okay, so that was 11th. Let's go to the last question, question 12. Okay, unlike the author of passage 2, the author of passage 1 makes significant use of direct quotation, sociological analysis, hypothetical assumptions, historical sources, and personal experience. So even when we were discussing the relationship between the passages, we did say that a primary difference between the first and the second passage is that the first one is more personal in outlook, right? It talks about the author's own experiences growing up in a Filipino American household. So I definitely like option E, right? Direct quotation is something that the second passage does, so A is not correct. Sociological analysis, this seems to be a broad term, but even if I had to kind of choose it, I would choose it for the second passage, not the first one. Hypothetical assumptions, I don't think there are any hypothetical assumptions made, because even the second passage kind of presents it in a way that seems that there is evidence for it. And anyway, the first one doesn't, so C is not good. And historical sources. Again, historical sources is completely missing from the first passage. It's all about the author's personal experience. So for 12th, I think E is the best answer. There are two tiny passages here with two questions each. First passage, mechanical pencils rule. My 15-year-old grandniece Genevieve declared when I invited her to her generation's boys on school supplies, nobody sharpens anymore. Then continuing with the fashion maven's hyperbole and arbitrary imperatives, she gave a passionate disquisition on types of clickers, new grips, smaller lead sizes, and other niceties of pencil selection. As she consigned the yellow painted wooden pencil to the wastebasket of history, I felt a rush of nostalgia for the perfumed sharpener shavings of my youth. So, a very short passage, but a lot is packed here. We are discussing an unnamed narrator and his grandniece, Genevieve, and they are discussing the way pencils have changed, right? Particularly Genevieve, who talks about mechanical pencils, and she uses hyperbole, which is exaggeration, and arbitrary imperatives. An imperative is like, you must do this, you must buy it. So something like that is an imperative. So she uses them to kind of bring out her interest, her liking of mechanical pencils, while the narrator, the person who has written the passage, says that he remembers with great fondness the wooden pencils of his youth, right? Okay, so let's look at the first question. In lines 4 to 5, the author refers to a fashion maven's tone, primarily in order to. So why would the author compare the grannies to a fashion maven? A maven is like somebody who is really clued into a field, right? Somebody who really follows what's going on. So he refers to her as a fashion maven to kind of indicate that, you know, she was really good at describing her interest in mechanical pencils, right? She used what a fashion maven would use to describe her or his interest in a clothes line, right? So let's look at the options. The author refers to a fashion maven to imply that Genevieve has only a superficial appreciation of mechanical pencils, suggests that Genevieve is excessively concerned about her clothing, illustrate some of the exaggerated claims made by mechanical pencil manufacturers, emphasize the unpredictability of trends in consumer tastes, and indicate that Genevieve expresses her opinions with authority and flair. So, in all such questions, obviously, before 2016, there were 5 options. Now you have 4. But in all such questions, it's very easy, I think, to eliminate all but 2 options, right? So I can clearly eliminate B, C, and D here directly, right? Because the reference to fashion maven has nothing to do with Genevieve's clothing, right? The fashion maven reference is made to indicate how she describes her interest in mechanical pencils. So B is out. It has got nothing to do with manufacturers of pencils. So C is out. And it has nothing to do with unpredictability in consumer taste, right? That's not why a fashion maven is used. The term fashion maven is used. Now, I think the author is kind of trying to credit her knowledge of mechanical pencils, right? Even though he uses words that might indicate that, you know, he, like, hyperbole is not really a positive word, but when a fashion maven uses hyperbole, it is to kind of present an effect that you are deeply knowledgeable about what you are saying, and you're trying to kind of give the impression that, you know, that knowledge should transfer to the listener. So I like E better, right? E is a good answer because she expresses her opinions with the same authority and panache, with the same authority and flair that a fashion maven would express her opinions. In fact, A is not correct because it does not indicate a superficial knowledge. The way she speaks about it indicates her interest and her understanding of mechanical pencils. So let's write it here somewhere. For question 6, I would choose E. Okay. The author mentions sharpener shavings in order to portray a mood off. Now, you see, he says perfumed sharpener shavings. Does he really think that they were perfumed? I don't think so. What he's trying to say is that they were real, right? Like you could actually smell the wood on them, right? Unlike mechanical pencils, which are just made of lead. So it indicates this sense of nostalgia that he has for those pencils. So unrestrained joy, sentimental reminiscence, bitter disappointment, cautious optimism, and dark foreboding. So just unpack each of these options, and you know that he is kind of looking back at the past, he's being nostalgic. So right off the bat, I like B, right? That is, he's reminiscing and he's being a little sentimental about it. I know that we look upon sentimental as a word with negative connotations today, but it is somewhat, right? But it doesn't have to mean something that is uncalled for, because then we say that, oh, he's getting too sentimental. We are basically using it to say that he doesn't deserve to. But that's not what sentimental means. Sentimental means that you are getting carried away, but not necessarily in a bad way. Right? You're kind of like looking at something in the past. And that's what he is doing, right? He's reminiscing the past. He's looking at his own, he's looking back at his own fondness for wooden pencils. So I like B. Okay, unrestrained joy is exaggerated, right? There is like, it's just pencils at the end of the day. You don't really have to be unrestrainedly happy about them. So A is hyperbolic. It's exaggerated. There is no sense of a disappointment or a foreboding, right? So those are just silly options. And there's no, like, he's not optimistic about the return of these pencils or anything. Those lines are meant to indicate that he himself remembers them fondly. So D also doesn't make sense. So for 7th, I think the best answer is option B. Okay, let's do the next one. I'll just move this a little bit down so that we can look at the full passage. Yeah. So, and I'll also clear this. I was trying to write down the answers because I found an answer key for this test, which I would like to check my answers from. I'm not sure if the answer key is accurate because these are old papers, right? So it's a little hard to get the right answer key. But I think we might have found the correct one. So we'll see. Okay, let's do the second passage. 1 second. Yeah. Black holes are the most efficient engines of destruction known to humanity. Their intense gravity is a one-way ticket to oblivion, and material spiraling into them can heat up to millions of degrees and glow brightly. Yet they are not all powerful. Even supermassive black holes are minuscule by cosmic standards. They typically account for less than 1% of their galaxy's mass. Accordingly, astronomers long assumed that supermassive holes, let alone their smaller cousins, would have little effect beyond their immediate neighborhoods. So it has come as a surprise over the past decade that black hole activity is closely intertwined with star formation occurring farther out in the galaxy. So you see, these are short passages, but they have a lot of information packed into them, right? Like even this passage, which is like what, 12 lines, 12, 13 lines, it starts by kind of putting black holes on a pedestal. It describes them as these efficient engines of destruction where whatever goes into them is thrown into oblivion. Oblivion is when something is forgotten, something is not remembered anymore, right? And they're so powerful, the gravitational pull is so powerful that whatever gets into them heats up to a very, very high temperature and starts to glow. And then there is kind of a contrast where it says that, even though we have all these great things about black holes, they are quite minuscule by cosmic standards. They don't account for more than 1% of any galaxy's mass. And because they don't account for more than 1% of any galaxy's mass, astronomers have long believed that they would have little effect beyond their immediate neighborhoods. But it has come to light that they in fact have effects on the galaxies that they are part of, much, much farther from where they are present in those galaxies. So every line is kind of connected to the previous line and is either following from the previous line or is contrasting the previous line. So very, very information-packed passage. Okay, number 8. What best describes the function of the statements in lines 10 to 13? So 10 to 13 is that statement where the author talks about a surprise related to black holes. It summarizes the points made in the first 4 lines of the passage. It provides support for the argument asserted in the preceding sentence. It introduces a new view of information presented earlier in the passage. It challenges recent scientific findings. It offers examples to support a theory. So what is the purpose of this? The purpose of this last sentence is to kind of explain that what has been recently found about black holes is surprising because of what we have known so far, right? So it is not a summary. It's not a summary of the first 4. So I don't like option A. It provides support for the argument asserted in the preceding sentence. That's not correct because it is actually challenging the preceding sentence. The preceding sentence had said that astronomers had assumed that black holes don't have much effect beyond their immediate neighborhoods, and that's not true. So B is not correct. It introduces a new view of information presented earlier in the passage. So this looks like a good option. I'll keep it for now because there is a new view of information that has been presented. The information that was presented was, the fact that they do have intense gravity, but it was believed that they don't really affect anything beyond their immediate neighborhood. And this introduces a new idea that no, in fact, they can have large effects much, much beyond their neighborhoods. So I'll keep C for now. It challenges recent scientific findings. So that is not correct because it actually presents or introduces recent findings. So D is out. And it offers examples to support a theory. There are no examples presented here, right? Rather, that new idea that has come to light by scientists is presented, right? So the best answer for question 8 would be option C. Okay, let's go to the next one. Let me just clear some of this content. Yeah, and then we can move to the next one. Okay, 1 second. Yeah, question 9. Which of the following most resembles the relationship between black hole activity and star formation as described in the passage? So this is what is known as an analogy question. You have to find an option that is analogous to what is described in the passage. So lines 11 to 12 are saying that it has come as a surprise that black hole activity is closely intertwined with star formation occurring farther out in the galaxy. So star formation farther out in the galaxy is closely intertwined with, is closely related to black hole formation, black hole activity. Okay, 1 second. Yeah, let's go back here. So a volcanic eruption on one continent results in higher rainfall totals on another continent. Industrial emission in one region lead to an increase in airborne pollutants in adjacent regions. A drought in a wilderness area causes a significant loss of vegetation in that area. Decreased oil production in one country results in higher gas prices in oil-dependent countries. And overfishing in a gulf leads to an increase in the population of smaller aquatic organisms. So what was the relationship between black hole activity and star formation? Black hole activity in one region was supposedly affecting star formation in a very, very far off region, right? So if you think about it, option A seems to kind of mirror that. It says that volcanic eruption on one continent results in higher rainfall totals on another continent. So activity in one area leads to activity in some other area, which is what black hole and star formation is referring to in the passage. So I like A. Industrial emissions in one region lead to an increase in airborne pollutants in adjacent regions. This wouldn't be the same as what the passage is saying because adjacent regions would be like the neighborhood region. So they don't indicate that sense of far off that the passage is talking about. So B is not a good answer. A drought in a wilderness area causes a significant loss of vegetation in that area. So this again is the same area. So that concept of huge distance or large distance is not brought out. Decreased oil production in one country results in higher gas prices in oil-dependent countries. So this is an economic cause effect, right? It doesn't necessarily indicate a surprising phenomenon that emerges from natural activity in one place affecting natural activity in a far-off place. So this is not analogous to what we are describing in the passage. And overfishing in a gulf leads to an increase in the population of smaller aquatic organisms. So that also is within the same kind of region, the same part of the ocean where overfishing has led to an increase in the population of organisms that those fish would prey on. So this is more of a trophic cascade, and it doesn't really convey the sense of activity in one area, boosting activity in another. So the best answer is option A. So I'm doing the passage on the left first, question 6 to 7. Duke Ellington considered himself the world's greatest listener. In music, hearing is all. Judging by the 2 or 3 thousand pieces of music Ellington wrote, he could probably hear a flea scratching itself and put that rhythm into one of his compositions. For him, the sounds of the world were the ingredients he mixed into appetizers, main courses, and desserts to satisfy the appetite of his worldwide audience. He wasn't averse to going out in a boat to catch the fish himself. He would raise the fowl himself. But when that musical meal appeared before you, none of the drudgery showed. So, this paragraph is perhaps from an obituary of the musical composer Duke Ellington, who was really skilled at listening, right? He could really interpret sounds closely. He could distinguish between similar sounds. And we know that because it says here that, one second, I'll just annotate this. Yeah, it says here that he could probably hear a flea scratching itself and put that rhythm into one of his compositions, right? And then the paragraph describes his work by comparing it to that of a chef or that of somebody who prepares a meal. That the sounds of his world were the ingredients he mixed into appetizers, main courses, and desserts. So he was eclectic, right? He was very his tastes were varied, and he was able to listen into the smallest of sounds and use them in any of his compositions. And he wasn't averse to going out in the boat to catch the fish himself. He would raise the fowl himself. But when that musical meal appeared before you, none of the drudgery showed. So the reference to the fish and the fowl is to kind of speak about the work that he put into getting the sounds right for his compositions, right? So he put in the effort, he put in the work to hear every sound clearly and to understand how that sound could be used. And when he finally did use that sound, it was so smooth, it was so free flowing that nobody could have figured out the amount of work that he put into it. The author most likely refers to the flea in line 4. He could probably hear a flea scratching himself. So what's the purpose of that? Highlight Ellington's prodigious memory, emphasize the quality of Ellington's listening skills, indicate Ellington's interest in different animal sounds, suggest that Ellington's compositions were marked by rhythmic similarities, imply that Ellington could be overly concerned about minutiae. So I think the answer here would be B, because the purpose of that example, the flea example, is to indicate that his hearing was highly skilled, right? His listening was really skilled, and he could even probably hear a flea scratching itself, right? Obviously, that's an exaggeration, but that is meant to indicate how skilled Ellington's hearing was, right? So B is the best answer. It doesn't have to do with memory. We're not discussing memory, so A is not correct. It doesn't have to do with his interest in animal sounds, so C is not correct. This example is not about rhythmic similarities in Ellington's music, so D doesn't make sense. And this is not about Ellington's concern with minutiae. In fact, this is an example that the author of the obituary probably brings up, an exaggeration that the author brings up to indicate Ellington's skill. In lines 5 to 11, for him up to drudgery showed, the author's point is primarily developed through the use of comparison and contrast, appeal to emotion, exaggeration, metaphor, and humor. So I think it is very clearly metaphor, I would say, because it's not a real meal that he prepares, right? The meal is a metaphor for the way he works on his music, right? The idea of raising a fowl or catching fish, these are metaphors to indicate the amount of work that Ellington put into his music, right? So all of this is metaphorical. So I would go with D. right? There is no comparison here. It's not that Ellington's work is being compared with the work of any other composer. So it's not A. It's not an emotional appeal. So it's not B. I wouldn't call it an exaggeration because it's an analogy. It's a metaphorical analogy. It's like proving that his work is similar to the work of a chef, of a skilled chef, right? So it's a metaphor, and it's not humor, right? It could be humor in a different setting. The comparison could turn into humor, but it's not humor here. Okay, so we'll grade this after we are done with the second one. In the summer of 1911, the explorer Hiram Bingham III bushwhacked his way to a high ridge in the Andes of Peru and beheld a dreamscape out of the past. There, set against looming peaks cloaked in snow and wreathed in clouds, was Machu Picchu, the famous lost city of the Incas. This expression, popularized by Bingham, served as a magical elixir for rundown imaginations. The words evoke the romanticism of exploration and archaeology at the time, but finding Machu Picchu was easier than solving the mystery of its place in the rich and powerful Inca Empire. The imposing architecture attested to the skill and audacity of the Incas, but who had lived at this isolated site and for what purpose? So, again, this passage is packed with a lot of information. So, you know that there was this explorer, Hiram Bingham III, who kind of discovered this relic, this archaeological relic in 1911. And this was, this was on a high ridge in the Andes, right? So it wasn't something that was easily accessible. And he coined it the famous lost city of the Incas, right? That was his expression. It served as a magical elixir for rundown imaginations. An elixir is like a potion, 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 which is like a medicine which cures everything, right? By like a perfect cure. So why is it an elixir for rundown imaginations? Because it evoked the romance of discovery, right? It was a lost city which had been discovered by him. So it evoked the romance of exploration and archaeology. But finding it was easier than solving the mystery of the place, the passage says, because there was imposing architecture there which attested to the skill and audacity of the Incas. So it was important to understand who had decided to live in this isolated place. So finding Machu Picchu was just the beginning of the questions about the place, right? The words magical elixir primarily emphasize the motivation for an expedition, captivating power of a phrase, the inspiration behind a discovery, creative dimension of archaeology, the complexity of an expression. So I think I'll go with B because the magical elixir is this expression lost city, right? It served as a magical elixir because it had this captivating power, right? For people who had tried to find Machu Picchu and were unsuccessful, this lost city expression, indicated the romance of it being there and having finally been found, right? It wasn't the motivation for the expedition because the context in which it is used in the passage is to indicate that it was meant to evoke romance. It was meant to evoke surprise. It was meant to evoke this thrill of discovery, right? So it was not the motivation. So A is out. It's again not the inspiration behind the discovery. So those words don't make sense because in the context of the passage, the magical elixir is basically used to kind of capture the thrill of discovery, right? So it's not inspiration, it's not motivation. It's not the creative dimension of archaeology. We are not saying that archaeology has a creative side that is captured by these words. And it's not complex, right? The expression lost city is quite simple. So I think B is good. The mystery discussed in lines 10 to 13 is most analogous to that encountered in which of the following situations. So what is the mystery? The mystery was you had found the place, but you still had to figure out who had decided to go to this isolated place and build this imposing structure. Being unable to locate the source of materials used to construct an ancient palace, being unable to reconcile archaeological evidence with mythical descriptions of an ancient city, being unable to explain how ancient peoples constructed imposing monuments using only primitive technology, being unable to understand the religious function of a chamber found inside an ancient temple, being unable to discover any trace of a civilization repeatedly mentioned by ancient authors. Okay, so that's a good question. Let's work with elimination. So I don't think it's A, because it's not about locating the source of materials, right? We have not reached that far into the passage. We have basically looked at why would this be here? What is the purpose of the imposing architecture, right? So being unable to reconcile archaeological evidence with mythical descriptions. So we are not looking to reconcile anything, right? So B is out. Being unable to explain how ancient peoples constructed imposing monuments using. So I don't think it's that. I don't think it's about how ancient people constructed imposing monuments, right? That also would be the next stage once you have figured out the purpose of their existence, right? So as I keep coming back to this word, what's the purpose? Why did they establish a civilization here? Being unable to understand the religious function of a chamber found inside an ancient temple, right? So this, I think, is the closest, because it kind of indicates that the purpose of that religious structure, that is not clear. So I like D. Being unable to discover any trace of a civilization repeatedly mentioned. So that also is not true, because in the passage, the author was able to discover Machu Picchu.